They said wedding bells are the sound of forever, but when they rang for me, I felt something die inside. It wasn't joy that flooded my chest. It was panic, a tightening weight that whispered, "You're walking into something you won't escape." And as the echo of those bells rolled through the church, I realized I wasn't hearing the call to love. I was hearing the warning to run. The church was breathtaking that morning, the kind of beauty that should have made my heart feel safe. Candles flickered, white lilies lined the aisle, and everyone I loved sat smiling, waiting for me. I should have been floating on air, but I wasn't. My feet felt heavy, like each step forward would chain me to something unseen. I caught my reflection in the tall mirror by the door. The woman staring back wasn't glowing like a bride. She was pale, trembling, eyes glassy with dread. My mother stood beside me, her hands gentle on my shoulders. "You look like an angel," she said, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. Maybe she felt it too, that strange pressure in the air, that wrongness no one could name. The organ began to play, and for a moment I forgot to breathe. My bridesmaids opened the doors. The music grew louder. The world fell away until only one thing existed: Ethan. Standing at the altar, the man I thought I'd spend forever with. He looked perfect, just as he always did, calm, confident. But the moment our eyes met, something inside me snapped. His smile was soft, yet behind it I saw something dark flicker, a flash of cold detachment, a momentary emptiness that shouldn't have been there. My throat closed. I tried to take a step forward, but my legs refused to move. My pulse thundered so loud I could barely hear the music. My mother whispered, "It's time." I wanted to scream, "No, something's wrong." But the words died on my tongue. And then, without thought, without plan, I turned and ran. The room gasped as one. The bouquet slipped from my hand. My heels clicked against marble, the sound echoing through the stunned silence as I burst out the doors and into the storm outside. Rain poured down, soaking through the silk, dragging the dress heavy around me. I ran through the street, through the crowd, through the blur of voices calling my name. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that if I stopped, something terrible would happen. The fear didn't come from Ethan, not directly. It came from the space between us, from the look in his eyes that I couldn't explain. By the time I reached the outskirts of town, the hem of my dress was black with mud, and my chest ached from crying. I collapsed under the awning of a closed cafe, trembling as the rain turned to mist. The wedding ring gleamed on my finger, mocking me. For a long time, I just stared at it. Then I pulled it off and hurled it into the street. The tiny clink it made against the pavement was swallowed by thunder. I didn't look back. I didn't care where I went next. I only knew I couldn't go home. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The sky began to lighten as dawn crept over the horizon. I walked barefoot to the bus station, dragging my ruined dress behind me. No luggage, no plan. Just a hollow ache that told me I'd destroyed something precious, but also escaped something far worse. When the bus doors opened, I stepped inside. No one looked twice. To them, I was just another stranger leaving town. But as the city disappeared behind the fogged glass, I pressed my palm to my chest and whispered, "Why? Why did I run? What did I see? Why did it feel like something, or someone, was pulling me away before it was too late?" At that moment, I didn't know that the answer was already chasing me. I thought I'd fled from love that day, from a future I wasn't brave enough to claim. But 10 years later, when the truth finally found me, I learned I hadn't run from fear at all. I'd run from death, and the man smiling at me from the altar wasn't who I thought he was. They say you can change your name, your city, even your face, but not the sound of your own guilt. It follows you in whispers, in sleepless nights, in dreams that bleed into memory. I thought time would bury what I'd done, that distance would quiet the echoes of that wedding day. But guilt doesn't fade. It learns to wait, patient as a shadow. The first few months after I ran were a blur of movement and numbness. I remember the bus ride out of town, the rhythmic hum of the wheels, the fogged window that hid my reflection, and the strange calm that came from leaving everything behind. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I simply vanished. I changed my name to Anna Clark, dropped my phone into a river, and took the first job I could find. A night shift at a small motel, 2 towns over. It wasn't much, but anonymity was safer than comfort. People came and went there, faces I'd never see again. That's what I wanted, a life that no one could trace. But peace has a cruel way of mocking you. Every quiet moment becomes a reminder of what you're trying to forget. Some nights, I'd wake drenched in sweat, the faint sound of church bells echoing in my ears. Other times, I swore I could hear Ethan's voice calling my name, soft and distant, like he was standing just beyond the edge of my dreams. I told myself it was imagination, that trauma plays tricks when you don't let it heal. But there were nights when I'd wake to the sound of footsteps outside my apartment. Slow, deliberate, as if someone was circling my door. Once, I even thought I saw a figure across the street, standing under a flickering street lamp, unmoving, watching. When I blinked, he was gone. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it was punishment. I couldn't tell the difference anymore. Years began to pass, like smoke through my fingers. I worked. I slept. I survived. The world moved on without me. New headlines, new scandals, and eventually, no one cared about the runaway bride anymore. But the silence never truly left. It clung to me like perfume, familiar and inescapable. I told myself I didn't miss Ethan, that what we had wasn't real. Yet some nights, I'd wake with his name on my lips. The image of his eyes, dark, hollow, almost pleading, haunted me more than any nightmare. I used to wonder what became of him. Did he marry someone else? Did he hate me? Did he ever forgive me? I tried to rebuild. I moved to another city, changed jobs again, cut my hair short, and painted my apartment walls white, as if erasing color could erase memory. My co-workers called me quiet, reliable, distant. None of them knew that every time a church bell rang nearby, I froze for a heartbeat before pretending nothing happened. I never dated. I didn't want to feel that kind of vulnerability again, the kind that could blind me to the truth hiding behind a smile. I convinced myself I was safer alone, but deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't protecting myself from love. I was protecting myself from what love had turned into the day I ran. And yet, despite the silence, there were moments I'd catch my reflection and see her again. The woman in the mirror with trembling eyes, standing behind those grand doors. It was like the past had learned how to breathe through me, quietly reminding me that I couldn't outrun what I didn't understand. I thought I could keep pretending. I thought I'd buried that day deep enough to never see it resurface. But life has a cruel sense of timing. It waits until you almost forget. And then it drags the past back to your doorstep, wrapped in something as small and innocent as an envelope. It was a rainy afternoon when I found it. A plain letter slipped under my door, sealed with no name, no address. My hands shook as I turned it over, the paper damp with cold. On the front, written in faded ink, was a name I hadn't heard spoken aloud in 10 years. Amelia Clark. The woman I used to be. The woman I thought I'd buried. And that's when I knew the past I'd been running from had finally found me again. When you run from the past, it never chases you. It waits. It waits in the quiet corners of your new life, patient and merciless, until the moment you finally believe you're safe. I should have known better. The day I found that letter on my doorstep, I realized the past hadn't lost me. It had been following me all along, waiting for the perfect moment to whisper my name again. Rain fell steadily that afternoon, tapping against my window like fingers begging to be let in. I had just returned from work, exhausted, craving the silence that usually greeted me. But something was different. A thin envelope lay on the floor, half-soaked, slipped beneath my apartment door. At first I thought it was just another bill or some forgotten advertisement, but the paper looked aged, yellowed at the edges, soft from time. I picked it up, feeling the chill. It carried, and the moment I turned it over, my heart stopped. In faded ink, written in shaky handwriting, was a name I had sworn to erase from the world: Amelia Clark. For a long moment I simply stared, unable to breathe. No one called me that anymore. No one even knew it belonged to me. I had burned that name out of every document, every file, every part of my new life. Seeing it again was like looking into the eyes of a ghost I'd buried. I tore it open with trembling fingers. Inside, there was no folded page, no explanation, only a single scrap of paper, creased and worn, bearing one sentence. "You were right to run." That was it. 7 words that felt heavier than a confession. I read them once, then twice, then again, until the letters began to blur. My throat went dry. My first thought was Ethan. Was it possible he had found me after all this time? Was this his way of forgiving me or warning me? But the handwriting wasn't his. It was older, looped, almost hesitant. My mother? No. She had passed 3 years ago. My hands shook as I compared it in my mind to every note, every card I'd ever known. Nothing matched. Whoever had written this knew the truth I had never told a soul. I sat down on the couch, letter in hand, staring at the wall as if it might answer me. Every sound in the apartment suddenly seemed louder: the hum of the fridge, the rain against the glass, the faint creak of the floorboards. The air felt too still, too aware. I turned the envelope over, searching for a return address. There was none. The postmark was smudged, unreadable. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure I wouldn't trace it. The rest of the evening passed in a fog. I made tea and let it go cold. I tried to read, to distract myself, but the letter sat on the table like it was alive, pulsing with the questions I couldn't silence. You were right to run. From what? From whom? How could anyone else know? By midnight, I had stopped pretending I could sleep. I sat by the window instead, staring out into the wet street. Cars hissed through puddles, and every set of headlights that passed sent a tremor through me. For a second, I thought I saw a figure across the road, tall, still, watching. But the next flash of light revealed nothing there. The hours crept toward dawn, and I realized I couldn't live another day surrounded by questions. 10 years of running had already stolen too much from me: my peace, my trust, my name. If this letter had found me, then maybe the answers were still out there, buried where it all began. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. The moment I did, a strange calm settled over me, the kind that comes not from safety, but from decision. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, I packed a small bag, locked my apartment, and walked toward the station. I didn't leave a note. I didn't tell a soul. All I carried with me was that letter, its words etched into my pulse. As the train rolled out of the city, I glanced back one last time. The skyline faded behind gray clouds, and for the first time in 10 years, I was heading home. What I didn't know was that home was no longer the place I'd left. It was the trap that had been waiting for me to return. Sometimes the places you run from remember you better than you remember them. 10 years had passed since I'd last walked those streets, yet the air still smelled the same: wet pavement, blooming lilies, and the faint trace of scandal that never really dies. I thought I was returning as a stranger, but the moment I stepped off the bus, I realized this town had been waiting for me, and it hadn't forgiven me. The station was smaller than I remembered, its paint peeled and sign half rusted, but the silence felt heavy. watchful. My suitcase rolled over cracked concrete as I walked toward Main Street, and with every step, the past seemed to rise from the dust. The bakery still stood on the corner where Ethan used to buy me coffee. The old park bench where we'd once carved our initials was splintered, but the carving was still there, our names trapped in wood like ghosts refusing to fade. People recognized me before I spoke. Some froze mid-step, others turned away quickly, pretending not to see. A few stared too long, eyes filled with a mixture of pity and resentment. I heard the whispers before I saw their faces. That's her, the one who ran. 10 years, and still they spoke of me as if my escape had stolen something from them personally. I kept walking. The church stood at the end of the road like a relic of another life, its white paint dulled by rain, ivy creeping up the walls, the great wooden doors slightly ajar. When I pushed them open, the smell of dust and wilted flowers met me. The aisle was empty now. No music, no laughter, just the echo of my footsteps where vows were supposed to be spoken. I walked slowly, fingertips brushing the pews. I could almost hear the gasp from that day, the rustle of silk as I ran, the stunned silence that followed. Guilt twisted in my chest, sharp and familiar. For a moment I wanted to kneel, to pray for forgiveness, but I didn't even know what sin to confess, running or surviving. Outside, the sun had begun to set when I finally gathered the courage to go to Grace's house. She had been my maid of honor, my best friend since childhood, the keeper of every secret I'd ever had. Her porch light flickered weakly as I climbed the steps. When the door opened, the sight of her stole my breath. Grace looked older, thinner, her once bright eyes shadowed by something heavy. For a heartbeat, she just stared, lips parted, disbelief flooding her face. "Amelia?" she whispered, the name trembling on her tongue as though saying it might summon trouble. I nodded, unable to speak. She pulled me inside quickly and shut the door, locking it twice. Her house was dim, curtains drawn, tight. It smelled faintly of lavender and dust, and beneath it all, fear. We sat in her kitchen, the same table where we'd shared wedding plans years ago, and I told her everything, the letter, the handwriting, the sleepless night that followed. When I placed the envelope in front of her, her hands began to shake. She stared at my old name, written across the front as if it were cursed. "You shouldn't have come back," she said finally, voice breaking. "Not after what happened." "What happened?" I asked, leaning forward. "Grace, what are you talking about?" She pressed her lips together, tears filling her eyes. "You don't understand, Amelia. Some things were meant to stay buried. Your father, he tried to save you." Her words hit me like a slap. "Save me. From what?" Grace looked away, breathing hard, and for a moment the only sound was the rain beginning to fall outside. She stood, crossed the kitchen, and opened an old cabinet. When she turned back, she was holding a small wooden box, worn smooth with age. The initials carved into the lid were unmistakable, H.C. my father's. The sight of it made my stomach twist. I hadn't heard his name spoken in years without the dull ache of loss attached to it. Grace set the box gently in front of me, her eyes filled with something between fear and relief. "He wanted you to have this," she said. "He told me if you ever came back, to give it to you. But I prayed you never would." My fingers hovered over the lid, hesitant to touch it, terrified of what it might hold. The box was cold beneath my palms, its weight far greater than its size. Somewhere inside those wooden walls waited answers I hadn't dared to seek for a decade. I looked up at Grace, but she had already turned away, shoulders trembling. "Your father tried to protect you," she whispered again, "but not even he knew what it would cost." As thunder rolled outside, I unlatched the box, and the first secret of my past breathed back to life. It's strange how the dead can reach across years and still find ways to speak to us. My father had been gone for a decade, buried, mourned, and left in the past I'd tried so hard to outrun. Yet the moment Grace placed that small wooden box in front of me, I felt him breathing through the silence. It was as though the air around us thickened with memory, his cologne still clinging to the grain of the wood, whispering that he had left something unfinished. I didn't want to open it, and yet a part of me already knew. Whatever waited inside would change everything I thought I understood about the day I ran away. The box was old, but carefully kept, its corners smoothed by the touch of time and love. The carved initials on top, H.C., Henry Clark, my father, seemed to glow faintly under the kitchen light, like they still carried the warmth of his hands. For a long while, I just stared at it, afraid to break whatever invisible seal his spirit had left behind. Zar, wood smelled faintly of smoke and cedar, the same scent that used to fill his study when he worked late into the night. Finally, I lifted the lid. The hinges creaked like a sigh. Inside lay fragments of a life interrupted, photographs, folded letters, and one small brass key that gleamed even in the dim light. That key felt heavier than metal had any right to be. The photographs were first. My breath hitched as I recognized Ethan's face staring back at me from the grainy prints. He wasn't alone. Each picture showed him in different places, dimly lit alleys, quiet corners of parking lots, faces beside him blurred by motion. In one photo, he handed over an envelope to a man in a dark coat. In another, he looked directly into the lens, eyes tense, almost frightened. These weren't accidents. Someone had been watching him. I turned to the letters. My father's handwriting filled the pages, steady at first, but growing increasingly frantic the further I read. The ink grew darker, heavier, pressed deep into the paper as if he'd been racing against time. Words like danger, debts, and Ethan's silence jumped out between lines of half-finished thoughts. It wasn't just concern I saw in his writing. It was fear, the kind that comes when you've seen something you can't unsee. My heart pounded as I unfolded the final letter. The paper was torn at the edges, and a faint coffee stain blurred part of the text, but I could still read the date, the night before my wedding. If you're reading this, it means you did what I couldn't make you do. You trusted your instincts. I couldn't save myself, but I pray that I saved you. If anything happens to me, find the key. The truth is locked where they can't erase it. I stopped reading. The words swam before my eyes. He knew. Somehow, before everything fell apart, he had discovered what Ethan was involved in, and he had died trying to protect me from it. Grace sat quietly across from me, her hands trembling in her lap. He came to me that morning, she said softly. He looked exhausted. He said if anything went wrong, I was to give you that box. He made me promise. Her voice cracked. I could see the guilt in her face, 10 years of silence pressing down on her shoulders. I didn't want to believe him, she whispered. I thought he was just paranoid. But after you ran, after the funeral, I was too afraid to ask questions. I clutched the brass key in my fist, the cool metal biting into my skin. This belongs to his study, doesn't it? Grace nodded slowly. He locked the door himself the night before he died. No one's been inside since. A rush of dread crawled up my spine. The study had always been my father's sanctuary, the one place that smelled of ink, tobacco, and safety. The idea of opening it now, knowing what I knew, made my stomach twist. Yet beneath the fear, there was something stronger, an ache for truth. For years, I had carried the guilt of leaving him behind. But as I stared at those letters, I realized it wasn't guilt I'd been running from. It was the truth. My father hadn't just been a victim of fate. He'd been a man who knew too much. I stood up, sliding the key into my pocket, the box still open on the table. Grace reached for my arm. Amelia, don't go there tonight. Wait till morning. I looked at her, eyes burning. I've waited 10 years already. If I don't go now, I never will. Outside, the night was quiet, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. As I drove toward the house I hadn't seen since his funeral, the headlights cut through the fog, revealing the familiar gate and overgrown path. The house loomed ahead, dark, waiting, unchanged. When I stepped onto the porch, I could still hear the faint creak of the swing he'd built for me as a child. The brass key was warm in my hand, as if it had been waiting too. I slid it into the lock, turned it once, and heard the old door click open. And in that instant, I realized some doors aren't meant to be opened twice. Some rooms remember how to breathe after you leave them, and some hold their breath until you return. My father's study was the latter. When I pushed open the door, the air that spilled out was stale, heavy, untouched by time, yet thick with grief. The scent hit me first: tobacco, ink, and the faint trace of his aftershave. So vivid it made my knees weak. I had stepped into a tomb disguised as a room, and the moment I crossed that threshold, I knew I was no longer searching for answers. I was walking into a confession. Moonlight filtered through half-closed curtains, casting thin silver bars across the floor. Dust drifted through the air like slow snow. Everything was exactly where he'd left it, his jacket hanging on the chair, the record player frozen mid-song, a cup still half full of black coffee turned to mold. My breath fogged in the cold air, as if the room itself exhaled around me. I switched on the small desk lamp. The bulb flickered once, then steadied, spilling weak yellow light over stacks of papers and notebooks. My hands shook as I slid the brass key into the drawer lock. The click was small, but it echoed louder than thunder. Inside lay my father's secrets: 3 leather-bound journals, a bundle of cassette tapes marked with dates, and a thick envelope sealed in red wax, my name written across it in his careful script: Amelia. The sight of it cracked something in me. 10 years of guilt dissolved into something else entirely: terror. I sat in his chair and stared at the envelope for what felt like forever. When I finally tore it open, the sound was deafening in the silence. His handwriting filled the page, firm but tired, every line carved with urgency. If you're reading this, it means you survived. The words struck me like a blow. My heart lurched. My father had written this knowing he was already marked for death. I uncovered something I shouldn't have, the letter continued. Ethan is deeper in it than he admits. They used him, trapped him, and now they're using our family as leverage. If I go to the police, they'll come for you. I told Grace what to do if things turn. You'll think you're panicking, but it's me, telling you to run. Tears blurred the ink as I read on. He'd been forced into silence, watching helplessly as his daughter prepared to marry a man who had become the weapon pointed at them both. The night before my wedding, he'd sent Grace a message: stop the ceremony, no matter the cost. I dropped the letter, my pulse pounding in my ears. Everything made sense now: the suffocating fear, the unexplainable dread that had gripped me at the altar. It hadn't been madness. It had been instinct. His final warning carried through blood and memory. I opened one of the journals. Notes filled every page: financial records, names, phone numbers, cryptic references to shipments, accounts, collections. Ethan's name appeared again and again, always circled, always underlined. There were details about offshore transfers, coded communications, and something labeled Project Halo. My father had been investigating him right up to the night he died. The tapes were dated sequentially. I picked one labeled June 12th, meeting. When I pressed play on the old recorder, static hissed, then his voice. Steady, calm, almost resigned. If this tape is found, it means I couldn't reach her in time. They know I'm recording. They know I'm getting close. Ethan isn't the man he pretends to be. He owes them more than money. If she marries him, she'll inherit every threat he's made. I froze. My father's voice cracked at the end of the sentence, and then the tape clicked off. The house felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier. I wiped at my tears and reached for another journal, flipping through until a photograph slipped free and fluttered to the floor. I bent to pick it up, and the world seemed to tilt. It wasn't one of the old photos from my childhood. It was newer, clearer, printed on glossy paper. My hands trembled as I brought it closer to the light. Ethan. Alive. He stood beside a man I didn't recognize at first. Tall, suited, his face sharp and expressionless. But I had seen those eyes before. They stared back at me from one of my father's news clippings years ago. He was the man suspected in my father's death, the one police could never tie to the crime. The photograph was dated only 3 months ago. My stomach dropped. My father's killer was still alive, and Ethan was standing beside him. I stumbled back, the chair scraping hard against the floor. The letter slid from my lap, scattering pages of his handwriting like dying leaves. Somewhere in the silence, I could almost hear my father's voice again. You were right to run. But this time, it wasn't a warning. It was a command. Some truths don't die with the people who keep them. They wait in the dark, breathing quietly until you're foolish enough to go looking for them again. The night I found that photograph, I thought I was staring at an impossibility. A ghost with a pulse, a memory wearing the same face I once loved. Ethan's smile, captured beside the man who murdered my father, tore open every wound I'd buried. The dead weren't haunting me anymore. They were calling me home to finish what they started. I couldn't sleep after finding that photo. I sat in my father's old chair with the letter spread out before me, the room flickering with the pale light of dawn. The ink on the page seemed to shift each time I read it. The words, "If you're reading this, it means you survived," looping through my mind like a warning that had come too late. I kept staring at Ethan's face, the tilt of his head, that faint half-smile, and I realized I no longer knew the man in the picture. The eyes were his, but the life behind them was gone, replaced by something colder, something that understood the cost of silence. By sunrise, I'd made my decision. If he was alive, I needed to see him. Not for forgiveness, not for closure, but because I couldn't live another day, bound to questions that smelled like blood and grief. I traced his name through my father's journals, following fragments of addresses and banknotes until one led to a small coastal town, circled twice in red. A single note beside it read, "Ask EM." The drive there felt endless. Rain swept across the windshield in waves, the tires humming against the asphalt like a heartbeat I couldn't slow. With every mile, I felt my father's presence pressing closer. Not a ghost, but a conscience. By the time I reached the town, my nerves were stretched thin as piano wire. The streets were narrow, the houses slanted from years of salt and wind, and the ocean roared beyond the cliffs like it wanted to swallow the world. No one recognized the name Ethan Miller. But when I showed an old fisherman the photograph, he hesitated, eyes narrowing. "A man like that," he muttered, "lives up past the bluff, keeps to himself, doesn't welcome company." He said it the way people mention storms they've learned not to fight. Inevitable, dangerous, better left alone. The path to the house wound along the cliff edge, the waves crashing far below. The cottage came into view slowly, gray and crooked against the horizon, its windows clouded with sea mist. I stood outside for several minutes, heart hammering, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the shutters. Part of me hoped no one would answer the door, that I could walk away and pretend the past was still dead. But I knocked anyway. When the door opened, time folded in on itself. Ethan stood there, older, thinner, his hair streaked with silver and his eyes shadowed with years of things he would never say. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. The sound of the sea filled the silence between us. "You shouldn't have come," he said finally, his voice rough, lower than I remembered. "It's not safe here." I wanted to speak, but my throat locked. All I could do was stare at him, the man who had once promised me forever, now standing like a stranger behind a door that smelled of salt and regret. He stepped aside, motioning for me to enter. The cottage was small, sparsely furnished, the kind of place chosen by someone who no longer believed in permanence. Papers covered the table, maps, old receipts, and photographs of people I didn't recognize. A kettle hissed quietly on the stove, but the air felt cold, like even warmth didn't dare stay here long. When I finally found my voice, it cracked. "You're alive." Ethan turned toward me, his expression unreadable. "Alive," he repeated softly, as if testing the word. "That's one way to put it." I showed him the photo. His eyes flicked to it, then away. "You were there," I said. "With him. With the man who killed my father." He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture weary. "You think I wanted to be? Then why were you?" He met my gaze, pain glinting behind the exhaustion. "Because they made me. Because if I didn't stand beside him, he would have sent someone else, to you." The room swayed around me. "So everything my father wrote was true," I whispered. "You were part of it." "I was their mistake," he said quietly. "And you were my punishment." The kettle whistled sharply, cutting through the tension. He turned it off, his shoulders sagging. "I didn't lie to you, Amelia. I was trying to save you. I still am." Before I could reply, he moved to the window, parting the curtain just enough to look outside. His body went rigid. "What is it?" I asked. He didn't turn around. "They never stopped watching you," he said, voice barely more than a breath. I stepped closer, my pulse quickening. Through the fogged glass, I saw two shapes standing motionless by the road, silhouettes against the gray. Ethan looked back at me, eyes dark with dread. "And now," he whispered, "they know you've found me. You can run from danger, but you can never hide from the men who built it. They don't forget faces. They remember debts in blood, not numbers." That night, as the storm howled against the windows and the sea clawed at the cliffs below, Ethan finally began to speak. Each word he gave me felt like a confession carved out of guilt and fear, and by the time he finished, I realized that every moment of my life had been written by the same men who had killed my father, and spared me only because I had run. He sat across from me, the dim light from the single lamp casting deep shadows across his face. His hands trembled as he poured us both coffee, though neither of us touched it. The wind outside whistled through the cracks of the old cottage, carrying the sound of the tide, and something else, unease. Ethan didn't look at me when he began. "I borrowed money long before I met you," he said quietly. "It was supposed to be simple, a few investors, a fast return. But they weren't investors. They were collectors. They owned everything they touched." He paused, eyes fixed on the table, as if afraid to look up and see the judgment waiting in my gaze. "When I couldn't pay, they came for more than money. They wanted leverage, so they looked at who I loved." I felt the breath leave my lungs. "My father," I whispered. He nodded, eyes glistening. "He found out. He confronted them. He said he would go to the authorities, expose them. I told him not to. I begged him to walk away." His voice cracked on the last words. "A week later he was gone. Officially it was a heart attack, but I saw the man who stood over his coffin that day, the same one in that photograph. They made it look clean. They always do." The room seemed to shrink around us. My father's last letter, his fear, his warnings. It all fit together now, every piece forming a picture too awful to look at directly. Ethan's shoulders shook as he spoke again, his voice thin as smoke. "I told him to stop you from marrying me. I thought if you ran, they'd leave you alone. And he did it. He made sure you were afraid enough to run." My throat burned. 10 years of guilt, of nightmares, of wondering what was wrong with me. All of it collapsed under the truth. I had hated myself for obeying an instinct that wasn't mine, for ruining lives that didn't belong to me. But it turned out running had been the only thing that kept me alive. Ethan looked at me, eyes full of despair. "You think I wanted this? Every day, I wished you'd forget me, live a quiet life, stay invisible. But when you came back—" He stopped, his voice breaking. "They noticed." The words landed like thunder. "You mean they're still watching?" He nodded slowly. "They never stopped. They think your father told you something he discovered before he died. And now that you've come back, they think you remember it." Outside, a branch scraped against the glass with a sound like nails. I turned toward the window, half expecting to see movement, but there was only the darkness of the cliffs. "What could he have left behind?" I asked. "All I found were his journals." Ethan hesitated, rubbing his temples. "Those men don't move for rumor. They move for proof. Whatever he found, whatever evidence he had, it's still out there, and they believe you can find it." The realization hit like a blade. My father hadn't just been investigating them. He had found something they couldn't bury, and now they believed that knowledge had passed to me. For the first time, Ethan looked directly at me, his expression both pleading and resigned. "You have to leave again, Amelia. Tonight. You can't fight them. I barely survived the first time." I shook my head. "You're asking me to run forever." "I'm asking you to live," he said softly. "Because if you stay, they'll finish what they started." The storm outside intensified, thunder rolling over the cliffs. A flash of lightning lit the room, and for an instant, I saw the fear on his face as something more than regret. It was prophecy. A loud crack split the air, followed by the sound of tires grinding over gravel outside. Ethan froze, his eyes darting toward the door. "They're here," he whispered. The lamp flickered, plunging us into half-darkness. My pulse pounded as I stared at the shadow moving past the window. Ethan reached for my hand, his grip cold, desperate. "Whatever happens," he said, "don't let them find what your father hid." The knock that followed was slow, deliberate, 3 times, and in that silence, I knew the past had finally caught up with us. Fear doesn't whisper. It watches. It stands quietly in the corners of your life, memorizing your patterns, waiting for the moment you start to feel safe again. After that night at Ethan's house, safety became an illusion I could no longer afford. The ocean behind me had gone still, too still, as if the world itself was holding its breath, and from that silence, I knew something had already followed me home. I left the cliffs before dawn, the horizon still bleeding gray over the sea. The road back to town was slick with rain, and though I drove fast, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every reflection in the rearview mirror looked darker than it should have been. Every turn of the road felt too familiar, as though I were being guided somewhere, rather than fleeing. By the time I reached the small motel where I'd been staying, the exhaustion had become a second skin, but so had the fear. For the next few days, I tried to keep my head down, pretending I could still blend in, pretending the world hadn't shifted beneath me. But pretending became impossible when I noticed the car. It was an old black sedan, parked across from my room every morning, never leaving even when the sun set. I told myself it could be coincidence, but each time I drew the curtain back, I felt the invisible weight of someone's gaze pressing through the glass. Then the calls began. They always came late, between midnight and 3 in the morning. I would answer, heart racing, only to be met with silence. No breathing, no words, just the faint static hum of a line that refused to die. I stopped answering after the 3rd night, but the phone kept ringing, as if it knew I was still listening. Ethan called me once during that week. His voice was strained, the background filled with wind and static. "They found out about the letters," he said abruptly. My breath caught. "What letters?" "The ones your father wrote," he replied, his voice trembling. "They were never meant for you to find. You have to destroy them, Amelia. Every page, every note." "Who found out?" I whispered. There was a long pause. Then he said quietly, "The ones who killed your father." Before I could ask more, the line went dead. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. I tried calling him back, again and again, but it went straight to voicemail. The next morning, I drove to the cottage, but it was empty. His car was gone. The door hung slightly open, the wind moving the curtains inside, like the breath of something unseen. I found his coffee mug still on the table, the liquid inside cold and untouched. He had vanished without a trace. That same day, I tried to reach Grace, desperate to warn her. She didn't answer. When I went to her house, the lights were off, and the mailbox overflowed with unopened letters. Her neighbor said she'd left in the middle of the night. No note, no suitcase, just gone. Panic set in. I went to the police, but they treated me like a ghost from a scandal they'd long forgotten. The moment I said Ethan's name, their expressions changed from sympathy to suspicion. One officer leaned back in his chair and said, "Miss Clark, or whatever name you go by now, maybe it's time to stop chasing fairy tales." Fairy tales. That's what they called my father's death. I left the station shaking. By the time I reached the motel, dusk had already swallowed the sky. The black sedan was still there. Only this time, I saw movement behind the windshield, a flicker of light, the glow of a cigarette. Someone was inside, watching. I shut my door, locked it twice, and sat on the bed, clutching my phone. I wanted to call Ethan again, but fear kept me still. What if they were already listening? That night, the wind rose sharply, whistling through the cracks in the walls. I turned on the radio for noise, but the static only made it worse. My hands shook as I reached for one of my father's tapes, pressing play to drown out my thoughts. His voice filled the room, steady but strained. "If they ever come for you," he said, "don't trust the silence. The silence means they're already there." I froze. The tape clicked softly, ending mid-sentence. For a moment, everything was still. Then, from the hallway outside, came a sound that made my blood run cold. 3 soft knocks. Slow, even, deliberate. The air turned heavy, pressing against my chest. I crept toward the door, barefoot, every board beneath me creaking like a warning. The peephole showed nothing but darkness. Then came another sound, low and intimate. A voice, whispering through the keyhole. It wasn't a stranger's voice. It was the one I hadn't heard in 10 years. "Amelia," it breathed, my name curling like smoke through the metal. I stumbled back, heart pounding, the sound pulling me between memory and madness. "Open the door," it whispered again, softer this time, as if it already knew I would. And just before I turned away, the light under the door flickered, followed by the unmistakable shadow of someone kneeling to listen. Some moments don't arrive quietly. They crash into your life, like storms disguised as ordinary sounds. That night, fate didn't creep through shadows or whisper from the corners of my mind. It knocked, loud enough to make the walls remember every secret I'd ever tried to hide. My father used to say that truth has its own patience, that it waits until you're too tired to run before it comes to claim you. Standing in that motel room with the rain pressing against the windows, I finally understood what he meant. The truth doesn't chase. It corners. The first knock was firm, but polite, almost civilized, as if danger had learned manners. I froze halfway between the bed and the door, every muscle locked in place. For a long breath, I told myself it could be housekeeping, a mistake, anything ordinary. But ordinary no longer belonged in my world. The second knock came sharper, deliberate, cutting through the hum of the neon light outside like a blade. My father's letters lay spread across the bed, their edges curled from the damp air. I gathered them with shaking hands and slid them beneath the mattress, pressing them flat as though the weight of the mattress could smother the kind of truth people kill for. My pulse thundered in my ears as I turned the handle. The hallway light spilled in, pale and sterile. 2 men stood side by side, framed against the peeling wallpaper. Their suits were identical, black as oil, their shoes gleaming in the weak yellow glow. Neither spoke at first. They simply studied me with the calm precision of men who already knew the outcome of every conversation they started. "Miss Clark," the taller one said at last, his voice smooth, almost courteous, the kind of tone that sounds safe until you listen too closely. I swallowed hard. "You're mistaken. I don't—" He smiled, slow and deliberate. "We're not mistaken." The second man produced a small card from his pocket, blank on both sides, and placed it on the table just inside the door. "We're here to offer some advice," he said, his eyes flicking briefly toward the shadows where my father's papers were hidden. "Curiosity can be a dangerous inheritance." I wanted to speak, to demand answers, but words refused to come. The taller man took a measured step forward, the smell of rain and cologne trailing with him. "Some truths," he said softly, "are meant to stay buried. Your father didn't listen either." It wasn't a threat shouted or implied. It was a memory delivered. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The hallway seemed to stretch and blur. My father's voice echoed in my mind, that last line from his letter. "If you're reading this, it means you survived." Survived. As if survival was only temporary. When I didn't reply, the men exchanged a look, a silent conversation I wasn't meant to hear. Then they both smiled, cold, rehearsed, and turned to leave. Their footsteps faded, down the hall even, unhurried, like men walking away from a finished job. I closed the door with shaking hands, bolted it, and leaned against it until the trembling in my legs subsided. The room felt smaller now, the shadows deeper. I pulled the papers back out and read my father's words again and again until they blurred into meaningless ink. He had tried to warn me. He had tried to warn himself. Hours passed before I could think clearly enough to move. When I finally picked up the phone, my fingers dialed the number I'd promised myself I'd never call again. Ethan answered on the first ring, his voice rough and uneven, as though he'd been expecting this moment all along. "They came to me," I said. "Two men. They know everything. About my father. About the letters." He was silent for a heartbeat. Then quietly, "Then it's begun." I pressed the receiver tighter to my ear. "I'm not running this time. I'm done hiding from ghosts that still breathe." His exhale crackled through the line, half relief, half dread. "Then meet me where it all began." The words settled heavy in my chest. There was only one place he could mean. The church. The place where my life had stopped, and somehow begun again. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I sat in the dark, the hum of the motel light filling the silence, the weight of the past closing in like walls. Somewhere deep inside, the part of me that still believed in endings whispered that I should walk away. But endings weren't made for people like me. They were earned, and mine waited behind those church doors. The next evening, I stood once more at the steps of that church, the same cracked stone beneath my shoes, the same heavy doors yawning open like a wound that had never healed. The wind carried the faint echo of wedding bells, long silenced. I pushed the doors wide, and the smell of dust and candle wax hit me, the scent of everything I had lost. Each step toward the altar felt like a heartbeat counted backward. Then, in the stillness, a single sound split the air, sharp, deafening, final. And for the second time in my life, my wedding church became a crime scene. Some places never forget the sound of your footsteps, even after the world has stopped remembering your name. I had fled this church once, barefoot and breathless, my wedding veil tangled in rain and shame. Back then, I thought I was running from love, from fear, from my own weakness. But as I stood again before its doors, 10 years older and a lifetime wearier, I realized the truth. I had never escaped. I had only been walking in circles, waiting for the past to open its jaws and swallow me whole. The doors groaned as I pushed them open, their hinges crying out like something alive. The air inside was thick and unmoving, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Every pew sat empty, coated in a fine shimmer of dust that sparkled faintly in the light slipping through the stained glass. It was the same light that had once bathed me in color as I walked toward Ethan on my wedding day, except now it painted everything in the quiet colors of ruin. Ethan stood at the altar, a solitary figure cast in the half-light. His hair was damp, his coat torn at the sleeve, his eyes darker than I remembered. He looked like a man carrying the weight of too many ghosts. When he turned toward me, I saw a strange calm in his face, the calm of someone who had already accepted how his story would end. "It's over," he said softly, lifting a folder from the altar table. "This is everything." I hesitated, my voice barely a whisper. "What's in it?" He stepped closer, opening the folder with shaking hands. "Proof," he said. "Every name, every transaction, every lie, the debts, the murders, your father's death." The words sliced through the silence like a blade. My chest tightened as he laid the papers before me. Bank statements, coded letters, photos of meetings, signatures I recognized from my father's handwriting. One image stopped my breath entirely. My father standing with the man who had orchestrated everything. The same man I had seen in Ethan's photographs. The same man whose name had been erased from every public record. Ethan's voice faltered as he continued. "He tried to negotiate with them. To protect you. He thought he could buy your safety with his silence. But there's no bargaining with men who trade in blood." The candle beside us flickered violently, a bead of wax sliding down its side like a tear. "Once you take this," Ethan said, his gaze fixed on mine, "they'll come for me. But you'll be free. You'll have what your father wanted you to find." I stared at him, my pulse hammering in my throat. "You're talking like this is goodbye." He gave a small, sad smile. "For me, it's always been goodbye." My hand trembled as I reached for the folder. The paper felt heavier than it should have, like it carried every unanswered question of the last decade. The moment I touched it, a strange stillness fell over us, the kind that comes just before a storm breaks. Outside, headlights cut through the stained glass, splintering the colors across the church walls. Ethan froze. "They're here," he said. The world shattered with the next sound, the deafening crack of gunfire. The glass exploded inward, raining shards of red and blue light. I dropped to the ground, covering my head as splinters of wood burst from the pews. The folder slipped from my hands, scattering papers across the stone floor. Every shot echoed like thunder, drowning out the pounding of my heart. I crawled toward the front, trying to reach Ethan, but the smoke and dust blurred everything. His voice cut through the chaos, weak but clear. "Now you know," he whispered hoarsely, "why you had to run." Then another shot rang out, closer this time, louder. The silence that followed was unbearable. When I finally lifted my head, the air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and candle smoke. My ears rang as I pushed myself up, vision spinning. The candle at the altar had gone out, leaving the room in flickering twilight. Ethan was gone. Only the folder remained, lying open beside the pulpit, its papers soaked and sticking together, the dark stain spreading slowly across the floor beneath it. I stumbled toward it, calling his name, but the only reply was the echo of my own voice. As I reached for the bloodied pages, the doors behind me creaked open once more. Quiet, patient, familiar. And this time, I knew whoever had entered wasn't there to finish the story. They were there to erase it. There comes a moment in every life when running isn't about escape. It's about survival. I used to believe courage meant staying, standing your ground, proving to the world you were strong enough to endure. But I've learned that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is walk away from the fire before it consumes them completely. When I fled my wedding 10 years ago, I thought I was destroying my future. Now I know I was saving it. Running was never the end of my story. It was the only way to live long enough to understand why I ran. The weeks that followed the gunfire felt like living in a dream, stitched together by grief and exhaustion. I was questioned by detectives, photographed by journalists, and pitied by strangers who spoke my name like a legend they didn't believe. I turned over every piece of evidence my father and Ethan had left behind. The letters, the photographs, the financial ledgers that carried the weight of 2 generations of silence. It didn't happen overnight, but piece by piece, the truth began to unravel. The documents exposed the syndicate that had destroyed my father's life. Politicians, financiers, and faces that had smiled through 1,000 charity galas while laundering blood through their hands. When the arrests came, they were quiet. Men in tailored suits led out of glass buildings, their heads bowed not from shame, but from the realization that they'd finally been seen. My father's name was cleared publicly. The newspaper headline read, "Journalist vindicated 10 years after mysterious death." But the victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like the faint echo of a war too costly to celebrate. I remember standing outside the courthouse, watching the snow fall, thinking how justice and peace are not the same thing. Justice ends the story for the world. Peace ends it for the soul. A few days later, the sea returned Ethan to the world he'd betrayed. His body washed ashore near the cliffs where he had once confessed everything to me. The coroner called it an accident. I knew it wasn't. I stood over his grave in the rain, holding the same lilies I brought for my father, and whispered the only words that felt honest. "You saved me, even when you didn't know how." I left the city after that. I couldn't stay where every corner reminded me of questions that had answers I already knew. The house my father built had been sold years ago, but I returned to our town anyway, to its quiet streets, its forgiving fog, the scent of the sea that had always reminded me of him. Time had folded over itself here. It didn't erase what happened. It just softened the edges of memory. Every year on the same day, I visit my father's grave. His headstone bears only his name and the words he told her to run. It was my choice, not his, but the meaning is the same. He gave me the instinct to trust the fear that day in the church, to listen when every other voice told me to smile, to walk, to obey. I kneel beside him, tracing the carved letters with my fingertips, and say, "You were right. I ran because you told me to, even if you had to die for me to hear it." Sometimes after the cemetery, I walk to the church. It still stands, though its roof sags and its windows are boarded. The wind slips through the cracks, and the pews creak as if the ghosts of that day are still shifting restlessly inside. I stand at the altar where it all ended and began, and I close my eyes. I used to feel shame there. Shame for the dress I left behind, for the vows I never spoke, for the people I disappointed. Now, standing in the dim light, I feel something else entirely. Gratitude. Gratitude for the fear that saved me. Gratitude for the father who refused to let me be buried in someone else's secrets. Gratitude for the man who loved me enough to die, telling me the truth. Because that day, I didn't run from love. I ran toward the life love had been trying to protect. The ghosts are quieter now. My father's voice comes only in dreams, Ethan's face only in the shimmer of the tide. They are no longer warnings, they are reminders. Every scar they left behind is a map of the woman I became. The truth is not something I found, it's something I finally understood. My wedding day didn't destroy my life, it delivered me to it. The girl who ran down that aisle died the moment her heart chose instinct over fear. The woman who stands here now is the proof of why she had to. Because sometimes, the only way to live is to run. If this story made you feel something, don't let it end here. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were in my place? Subscribe and turn on the bell, because the next story might just change how you see love, loss, and fate. And remember, every ending hides another beginning. You just have to stay to hear it.